rendered last line must make her happier. The two things which are kind of quite common in Jane Austen, but which I think are especially illustrated in this passage, which is, first of all, that despite what Emily Bronte's sister Charlotte said about Jane Austen did do feeling. She was interested in feeling, and Persuasion, the last of her novels, the most autumnal, is about sort of strangulated passion. But also, and I hope you won't mind me being sort of a little bit sort of academic or dusty about this, that's no virtue in itself if it weren't for the second fact, which is her incredible technical audacity. Because the thing about Jane Austen is that she wasn't just an elegant writer and a funny writer, she was also technically and formally one of the most experimental novelists in the history of English literature. And lots of the later novelists, from Henry James to Nabokov, who condescended to her later, nicked all her techniques, actually. And the technique you heard in this piece, which was one she invented it at a parlour table in Hampshire. She invented it without knowing any other writers or belonging to literary circles or even having clever and interesting siblings who were writing novels as well. She just invented it on her own. And it's called free and direct style, and it's the most sort of important invention in the history of the novel, actually, because it's the means by which, as you heard Eleanor brilliantly do, Jane Austen appears to tell you a story, and yet lets the feelings of the character sort of bend and warp the narrative. That brilliant bit at the end. This must make her happier. Yes? Oh, I'm really pleased. He says I'm ugly. Oh, that's good. That's really, really good, because what it means now is I won't have any illusions about him coming back to me. Yes, that's very good. And Anne Elliot, you'll know if you've read Persuasion, has a certain strain of self-punishment, which is both painful and yet incredibly familiar, I think, to any adult reading it. And here in that passage, you can hear the drama of her own fluctuating feelings, but through Jane Austen's narrative. And it's kind of a miraculous thing that she did, and that nobody had ever done before. And that must, in the last sentence. Nobody had ever written that before she came along. There's lots of other, I couldn't resist looking at some other musts, which nobody would have written for Jane Austen. There's a wonderful one, I know she's a favourite character of many people, so I'll offer it to you quickly. Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice. Yes. Charlotte Lucas, after she has accepted Mr. Collins's proposal, after the lightning courtship of about 6 hours, which has lasted the length of a dinner at the Lucases, entirely in the company of the clamorous Bennet clan, but somehow she's intuited what his designs are 2 days after he's been turned down by Elizabeth, and she's accepted his proposal, and she's thinking about it, and she thinks, well, I'm going to be married, that's good. And then she also, it says, his society, Mr. Collins's society, his society was irksome. And his attachment to her must be imaginary. Brilliant. Yeah? Any novelist, apart from Jane Austen at the time, would have written, his attachment to her was imaginary. But no, his attachment to her must be imaginary. Must be because suddenly you're thinking with her. And that's why Charlotte Lucas is such a famous and vivid character. Not because we see her in a sort of feminist light as a woman who has to sacrifice, has to give up so much in order to kind of get material stability, has to sleep with Mr. Collins. She's pregnant by the end of the novel, you know. Did you know that? She's pregnant by the end of the novel. Yes, she is. She spends the whole day separate from him. She arranges the rooms so they never bump into each other. She sends him down the garden to do the chickens. He enjoys doing the chickens and the gardening, but at night, she shares a room. Sorry, I got diverted there, but you know that you do with Jane Austen. That example that Eleanor read, you then get at the end of the chapter in which it appears, Jane Austen takes you to Captain Wentworth. She leaves Anne Elliot. She takes you to Captain Wentworth and says that he did indeed say something like that, but of course with no idea that it would be carried back to Anne, because Captain Wentworth's not a cruel man. And he did say that, and she has him talking with his sister, Sophia, Admiral Croft's wife, Mrs. Croft. And he's talking about how he wants to get married, doesn't mind who, as long as they're nice about the Navy. And he says, I only need two things: a strong mind and sweetness of manner. And you think, oh, God, that's quite a tough call. But anyway, you've got to have both. And you're told that he's still cross about Anne Elliot rejecting him. And then Jane Austen writes this very innocent sentence: but her power with him was gone forever. And that's the last thing in the whole book you're told about what Captain Wentworth thinks. And it's not true. Clever, isn't it? It's the last thing you're told about his inner world, and it's not true. And you're left with her to watch his slowly, unwillingly at first, but then stimulated by jealousy, because she's brilliant on that, his feelings returning to her. And that too is a wonderful example of how narrative gives you somebody's self-deception as much as somebody's thoughts. Now the next piece is a kind of example of the consequences of self-deception. It's from Emma, and it's Christmas Eve, and Emma has been persuading herself and her stooge, the stupendously dim-witted Harriet Smith, that Harriet, although she is the daughter, she's the illegitimate daughter of a mere somebody, should be aspiring to marry the new vicar, Mr. Elton, slick Mr. Elton, and that Mr. Elton is really interested in her. We actually know, any decent reader knows that Mr. Elton's interested only in the Queen of Highbury, Emma herself. But Emma doesn't see this. And then on Christmas Eve, after a bibulous party at the Westons, she finds him in the back of a carriage with her on the way back, and in a phrase that I sometimes have to explain to incautious first-year students not used to Regency English, making violent love to her. And we're going to have some of this scene, please.